Welcome to the Death, Taxes and Change podcast, the podcast where the certain things in life are not as certain as you may think. And today, Paul and I have the wonderful honor of having with us in this interview, Mr. Michael Swain from Freedom of Religion, South Africa. Michael, welcome here today.
Thank you, and great to be with you.
It's wonderful to have you in such an honor, and we've been trying to make this arrangement, but you're quite a busy man, and you're obviously doing fantastic work at Forsa. Would you perhaps just like to tell our listeners that don't necessarily know exactly the work that you guys do, what is Forsa and what do you guys aim to achieve?
Well, Forsa is, we would best describe ourselves probably as a legal advocacy group. But interestingly enough, the reason why Forsa came into existence was because some now in 2014, a church called Joshua Generation were effectively ambushed by a militant atheist couple who lived in the neighborhood of the local church and got onto their website, and they just done a parenting seminar. They downloaded the manual, which had some of the so-called spanking scriptures, the sort of spare the rod, spoil the child scriptures. Mm-hmm. And then they filed that with the South African Human Rights Commission, who then launched a case against Josh Gen. And the senior pastor and founder of that church, Andrew Selly, called me when he got the writ, quite astonished. And I said to him at the time, I said, Andrew, this is definitely not something that you should try and fight on the merits of should you or should you not discipline your child with some form of physical correction. It is everything to do with freedom of religion, because if they can, which is what they were asking or instructing, they were instructing that they should remove with immediate effect all those scriptures from all their teaching materials, to not teach those scriptures again, and to send their pastors for sensitization training. And that is, of course, a deeply chilling invasion of freedom of religion. So on that basis, he connected with advocate Nadine Badenhorst, and together they effectively founded Freedom of Religion South Africa, known as Forsa, and immediately discovered that this was really just the tip of the iceberg. And unfortunately, there is a certain prevalence on behalf of the institutions, the commissions particularly, to take on board cases which individuals stir them up to. And of course, that's quite unfair, because then they're spending state money and they've got bottomless pockets, but they're actually going after people who can't afford it. And I think the strategy, therefore, is often to set legal precedents. So most of what we do in Forsa is we are looking at the legal aspects of particularly defending our constitutional Section 15 right, which is the freedom of religion, conscience, belief, opinion, so that we must make sure wherever there is an incursion or something starting to erode it, no matter what sphere of society it may be in, that we are at least on the lookout for it. So whether it's legislation coming down the pipe, whether it's court cases where we may feel we need to at least join as an amicus, sometimes we might decide to take it on directly, whether it's reports by commissions like the CRL, which was instituting an idea for state regulation of religion. These are the things where we sort of get involved, and we're obviously watching it and informing as well. We have a very widespread information network to pastors and senior leaders, so that we also alert people to the threats.
So, Michael, obviously my colleague on the Death, Taxes and Change podcast, Daniel, is a legal scholar and an attorney. So he's obviously at this moment scrolling through the Constitution of South Africa. But
right.
if you can maybe tell us what constitutes freedom of religion. And for myself, I like studying philosophy, Enlightenment philosophy, and so on. And I know John Locke spoke a lot about religious tolerance. And I think probably some people, especially second or third language speakers, could probably confuse the two. So if you can maybe elucidate on what you see as freedom of religion and how it differs from, for instance, tolerance for another religion.
Well, freedom of religion certainly incorporates tolerance for all religions. I mean, it is certainly not specifically applicable to one religion. Freedom of religion, as guaranteed under the Constitution in South Africa, applies equally to all religions and all beliefs. So I think importantly, just to take one step back and say, well, what is freedom of religion? Freedom of religion is actually a basket of human rights. And that's sometimes why it's very dangerous when freedom of religion is attacked, because it's seen sometimes to be a bit of a soft target. Religion in today's society, particularly with many left-wing agendas in play, tends to be seen as narrow-minded and bigoted, and irrelevant and out of date, and really something which should be somehow quashed or stopped, or at least told to shut up. But in fact, what you are talking about with freedom of religion is you're talking about freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of belief, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly. I mean, these are all foundational human rights. And one of the biggest problems is that when these rights are effectively attacked because somebody's freedom of religion is being attacked, if you allow that to crumble, you are actually eroding the underlying fundamental human right, which undergirds freedom of religion. And that's why sometimes it isn't just a question of tolerance towards your belief, or that you should be allowed to believe what you believe and express that belief. But if you are blocked from doing so, then you have to ask the question, well, what happens when this flips into the socio-political realm, for example, and you remove all the defenses?
I often, I think it's so, well, speaking as a Christian, and I think Paul and I are both very open about our religion and our views on religion on this podcast. And I feel sometimes as a society and as the whole world, generally speaking, we neglect the fact that religion, especially in the West, and especially the Christian religion, gave rise to a lot of these constitutional rights or human rights that we see today. So the church gave freedom of speech. I mean, a lot of people don't necessarily believe that, but the point is the church created this space where people could practice free speech. The church and Christianity gave rise to a lot of these human rights. It gave rise to a free society as we know it today. And I completely agree. If we start eroding freedom of religion, especially in South Africa and especially in the West, then I mean, it's in the end, it's just a slippery slope and a few steps away from banning or limiting other rights such as expression or whatever other classical rights you talk of.
No, you're 100% correct. I mean, the roots of the freedoms which we enjoy in the so-called Western democracies are absolutely rooted in biblical principles. And people literally paid with their life's blood for the freedoms that we enjoy today. And again, the big danger is, of course, is that we live in a society where we have tremendous tolerance in the broad sense as a consequence of these very beliefs. And the danger is, of course, that if you look around at other aspects, other parts of the world, other societies, there's very often little or no freedom of religion.
Yes,
Western societies are extremely tolerant because I think because we believe that everybody is ultimately entitled to the dignity that comes from being a human being to be able to express what it is that you believe. I mean, God granted us the freedom of choice in that sense. And so we just have to be very cautious when we see the very foundations upon which a society is built being eroded on the basis of maybe sort of ideological agendas or political correctness, quote unquote.
Yeah, it's a while back I wrote an article where I spoke about the one-way street of I was almost going to call it progressive intolerance, and it's exactly that. It's tolerance of diverse views with the caveat as long as those views align with whatever the mainstream thinks at that time.
Yeah, 100%.
And I think it's exactly the same. And it's interesting to me that you say that religion is almost a scapegoat. It's an easy, soft target, because I think we see it more and more often that people will just completely just say, it's just, like you say, religious bigotry, and then blame it on that as if that's the whole explanation. And people kind of take out I almost want to say Christianity at least admits that people are broken and that sin is a reality, and that therefore we need to act on it and work with it, where they'll just say, it's just because of religion, and then they almost blame it on that as if it's a answer to all issues.
Yes, and we have to obviously be very, very cautious, because as you say, Christianity can just become a punching bowl.
Yes,
punching bag rather. And I'll give you an international example. There was a case known as the Asher's Bakery case. And what happened there, this is an Irish case, that there was a debate over same-sex marriage going on, and a homosexual activist contacted Asher's Bakery with the name Asher, so evidently was a Christian bakery, and asked them to bake a cake, and they said yes, and then the next thing was, and you must now decorate it with a sort of a Simpsons type of imagery, and it must say support gay marriage. And the bakery very politely said, look, we'd certainly bake you a cake, but we really do not feel at all comfortable with being forced to put our efforts into promoting a message which we really can't agree with because of our convictions in the Bible that marriage is a monogamous relationship between a man and a woman, and that's been the traditional belief of Christianity and millions of people for centuries. Well, immediately here comes a lawsuit, again filed by the Human Rights Commission in Ireland, and the terrible thing about it was that it literally migrated up through the courts, and every court, even the Court of Appeal, basically said that you can be forced to promote a message, whether you agree with it or not, whether you believe it or not. And only when it got to the Supreme Court, which used to be the House of Lords, did they, thank God, take the viewpoint, no, you should not be allowed or forced to promote a message. Because again, if you think about it, if you had destroyed the defense of freedom of speech and freedom of expression in that instance, which is obviously has a negative thing. In other words, you can be forced to, but you shouldn't be forced not to. If you think about that, what's to stop you being forced to say any message?
Yeah. Was this case, the Irish case you refer to, before the Masterpiece Cake Shop, the Colorado estate?
They were running concurrently. And the interesting thing about the Masterpiece baking case was that it was actually dismissed by the Supreme Court of the US on a technicality, in a sense, because they said that the way that the Colorado Human Rights Commission had treated Jack Phillips, who was the baker in question, or the cake decorator in question, was unfair and discriminatory. So they actually dismissed it on the way that he was treated, rather than on the merits of the fact that he should not have been forced to do that in the first place. And interestingly enough, literally 10 days later, the same Colorado Human Rights Commission launched another case on a different issue against the same man, which fortunately has now also been withdrawn. But it just goes to show how intolerant these agendas are, and how almost like pervasive this thing becomes.
So, Michael, if I could bring it back to South Africa, and obviously if you guys are on the case currently, you can't really speak about it, I understand that. But we recently saw that a form of South African court gave itself the power to decide for a church denomination whether people may be allowed or not allowed based upon sexual preferences. Now, this obviously sets a very dangerous precedent, because if you can't refuse people to become reverends in your church for whatever reason, you lose your autonomy as a church denomination, and all of a sudden it would be like saying, well, we discriminate based upon religion, in the sense that you have to be religious to be a reverend, for instance. And then they would say, no, well, you're discriminating based upon religion, so you can't do that. That's sort of the slippery slope that we're getting on by telling a church they can't stop someone from becoming a reverend based upon sexual preferences, which has been, as you point out, historically against the church. Now, the question that I ask, obviously, is, we spoke now about Colorado and about Ireland, but is this something that in South Africa is becoming a problem? Do you see this court case, and I'm sure you know which one I'm talking about, to be an indicator of troublesome legislation and troublesome approaches, perhaps?
Well, it's in the case we're speaking about is I think Galm against the Dutch Reformed Church. And is that the right one? Is that the one that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's the one I'm referring to, yes.
So just briefly for the listeners' viewpoint, the facts of that case were that there was a decision taken by the Dutch Reformed Church Synod, which is its highest decision-making body, in 2015, to basically permit its ministers to not only perform same-sex solemnization unions and ceremonies, but also, if they were same-sex attracted, to live in open same-sex relationships. And that caused quite an outcry amongst other sectors of the same denomination. And as a result, the next year, a decision was basically taken to reverse that decision. And of course, Galm and company, who were happy with the first decision, were very unhappy with the reversal, and they then took it to court. And it was heard in the High Court, which is the court of first instance in this sense. And basically, the interesting part was that it should have and maybe could easily have been decided on the grounds of process and procedure. So, for example, the court at one point has effectively held that, because the Dutch Reformed Church held out membership to everybody, regardless of their sexual orientation, and offered courses to everybody, regardless of their sexual orientation, including courses training them for ministry, it was then unfair to then turn around to them and say suddenly, no, well, you can't, sorry. But unfortunately, they went on. And where we are at the moment is that they basically were taking the view that, even if they were now to look at the more substantive issues, that it might be, and in their view, I think they would say it is, unfair discrimination almost automatically if a church doctrine or even an internal church doctrine or even a belief which may have been expressed by people for centuries, it actually is contrary to same-sex orientation rights. And so it almost is a sort of a winner takes all. And the position that they were moving towards was to say that religious belief and freedom of religion rights are not a justification for this sort of discrimination, because bearing in mind, discrimination has to be unfair. Discrimination alone isn't the issue. It has to be unfair discrimination. And in so doing, of course, they also started to go behind the curtain and break through what's been otherwise known as the doctrine of entanglement, where courts have been historically extremely reticent to start looking at denominations and churches' internal processes and procedures for fear or lest they actually start to encroach on their freedom of religion rights. But that's now very much up in the air. And this matter is now in the process of an application really for clarification, because the judgment was open. It wasn't clear whether that latter section, when they're looking at the discrimination parts, were part of the ratio or the deciding factors of the case, or whether it was process, or was it both? And so that's really what's now being investigated. And that case is coming up on Friday, in fact. So by Friday, we should know, was it part of the ratio, or was it obiter dictum, which is just like remarks made off the cuff, which have no legal standing. If it was part of the ratio, then obviously that's an extremely dangerous precedent for freedom of religion, and potentially means that the courts are starting to move into areas which typically otherwise have been, for want of a better word, sacred or off limits. So yeah, very, very, very concerning case.
Essentially, what could happen then, if I understand you correctly, is we could get to a point where the government gives itself the power to essentially decide over clerical matters. Interdenominational matters are probably something else. So let's focus specifically on the management of a church denomination. If the government gives themselves the power to actually veto a decision by a church synod, then we are essentially losing, well, you could call that freedom of religious management, I suppose, not necessarily freedom of religion, as no one is being stopped from believing, but they are stopped from believing in the certain way that they do and that they understand the Bible to tell them to do. So would you say that would be a sort of a practical interpretation of what you're saying?
Yeah, well, yeah, I would say at the moment it's the courts that are doing it rather than the state. But the state isn't actually very far behind. So, for example, if you look at the Civil Union Amendment Bill, which has now been adopted by the National Assembly and is probably going to be passed pretty quickly early on in the new Parliament, what that bill is doing is removing the clause in the Civil Union Act, which, of course, solemnizes or permits the solemnization of same-sex unions. It removes the conscientious objection clause. And of course, the reason why the conscientious, we have two acts. We have the Marriage Act, and then we have the Civil Union Act. And the Civil Union Act was passed as a result of a constitutional court case called the Forsa case. The Constitutional Court, again, I think rightly decided from point of view of law that sexual orientation is an equality right, and it wasn't fair that heterosexual couples were allowed to enter into unions and all the benefits that enjoyed legally and otherwise, and same-sex couples were not. So that was why the Civil Union Act came to play. But specifically in the free judgment, it said that categorically, if people who were going to be solemnizing, marriage officers particularly, marriages or same-sex unions, they had the right to they conscientiously object. Their beliefs should be respected. Now, the reason why this union amendment, Civil Union Amendment Bill came to pass was because in some parts of the country, quite a lot of people were actually objecting, and same-sex couples were complaining that they didn't have enough people to marry them. And so COPE took up the cause. Deirdre Carter was their MP who championed it. And this is now going through. And again, politically, all the parties, barring one, the ACDP, expressed sort of almost disbelief that how on earth could this ever have happened in the first place? Why is this conscientious objection clause there? Well, it's there because the Constitutional Court put it there. But it's about to be removed. Now, here's the dangerous thing. If you remove conscientious objection from state marriage officers, we're talking, not at the moment from pastors, but from state marriage officers, then what you're effectively saying is that if you work for the state, you have to put your freedom of religion beliefs, and you have to put them in your back pocket and leave them at home, because you can now potentially be compelled, if you take on that task, to do something against your conscience, or alternatively, it's well, get another job.
Yes.
I mean, that is not freedom of religion. And yeah.
The point is that sorry to interrupt you, Michael, but that basically comes in my view, if you're able to use state power or state authority to compel a person to do something against their belief or against their will, what it means is, what you're essentially saying is, you're entitled to their time and their labor, meaning that it's in fact it's plain and simply slavery. I mean, if you can force a person to do something that they don't want to do, then I mean it's forced labor.
Yeah, well, alternatively, you get another job. I mean, you're not compelled to stay in the job, but again, that's also, we believe, absolutely unfair discrimination. And here's, often you've probably heard the expression, the law of unintended consequences.
Yes.
Well, every magistrate is de facto a marriage officer. And that means that as a magistrate, you will also be compelled potentially to conduct same-sex unions and to solemnize those. And that means that if you're a Christian who happens to believe firmly that that is not what the Bible teaches, and not something that in good conscience you could actually put your hand to or your name to, then you will not want to take up a career as a magistrate. And of course, then think about the impact of that, maybe sort of 10, 15, 20, 30 years time on the makeup of our judiciary. So, these things can have very chilling knock-on effects.
No, absolutely. And again, it's the whole point of the slippery slope. Michael, so could you perhaps tell us a few of the big matters we've discussed, the NG Church matter that I don't think you were directly involved with, but that you obviously have an interest in keeping an eye on how it progressed and developed. But some of the other matters, so you've mentioned the corporal punishment, the spanking case that Forsa did. Are there any others that might come to mind to our listeners?
Well, probably the biggest single threat, we believe, to freedom of religion rights in South Africa at the moment is the ongoing campaign by the CRL Rights Commission, who actually should be the biggest defenders of religious freedom, to push forward an agenda for state regulation of religion. And again, as soon as you see state regulation or state involvement or teaming up with a particular approved brand of religion, whatever that may be, historically, we need to learn the lessons of history, because every time it has been an absolute disaster for religious freedom, and people have been severely persecuted in the process. So the CRL Rights Commission is, of course, a Chapter 9 institution set up by the Constitution to give specific protection to cultural, linguistics, and religious rights, hence the CRL. And again, they have been, I would say, aggressively pushing an agenda really based upon some very inflammatory sort of media exciting cases, which they have almost tried to say is typical of how the religious community actually conducts itself, which is absolutely far from the truth, as anybody would reasonably know. The vast majority of people who are religious practitioners and pastors are actually wonderful people who just are trying to serve their calling before God and society as a whole. But again, I mean, this has been something which has been aggressively pushed. And of course, the state really has absolutely no business in deciding who should or should not be allowed to exist in terms of either you're practicing as a religious practitioner or as an organization or a denomination or a church or anything else, unless, of course, you're doing something illegal, in which case you can't hide your criminal activity or your illegal activity behind freedom of religion. And every time we see one of these high-profile instances happen, like the Prophet of Doom, you might remember the Prophet of Doom.
Yes.
The guy who sprayed insecticide in people's faces, sort of claiming that God had told him that they were going to be healed. And I mean, that plain and simple, when the law finally kicked into play, he was duly charged with 5 counts of assault and convicted and sentenced to 3 years in jail or a 30,000 rand fine. So, I mean, when the law takes its course and we have a extremely robust legal system and rule of law in this country, which covers all these types of abuses, and financial abuses, you name it. When that's applied, then it solves the problem. Of course, it does not solve the problem simply now saying, well, we now want to regulate religion and every pastor must now register and we need to look at whether the doctrines are acceptable, etc. Because in any event, that has to be enforced too. And if you're not enforcing existing laws, there's absolutely no point putting another sort of band-aid of also unenforceable laws on the top. And so, it is dangerous.
So, Michael, if I could maybe ask a last question from my side. What can, I mean, our average listeners obviously listen because they realize that we have certain principled views, and I like to think they obviously share some of those views or drastically disagree with some of them. But what can we as South Africans do to make sure that our religious freedom is protected? Basic everyday things that we can do to sort of check up and make sure that our freedom of religion is not being slowly taken away from us.
Well, the most important thing, of course, is to stay informed, because as I mentioned right at the beginning, when the case came against Joshua Generation and 4SA was formed and began to defend that case, it became evident that, oh my goodness, this is not just a single case, this is a trend. And, I mean, I'm currently looking at a list of sort of maybe 15, 20 cases just going through the course at the moment, which one way or another have the potential to erode religious freedom. So the first thing is to stay informed. And I would recommend that your listeners get onto the Forsa website, www.forsa or Forsa or forsa.org.za, and sign up for our free newsletter so that we will regularly send out, don't worry, we won't bombard you. Regularly might be once every couple of months with updates. And of course, we have a Facebook page, which is Freedom of Religion SA, which is more topical. And just stay informed. And when these issues do come out, sometimes and very often there's opportunity for public comment, because thank God we do have a democratic process. And what we try to do is to identify the issues, to make them understandable to the layperson, and then to put the tools in people's hands, in church leaders' hands, in organizations' hands, in individual hands, so that you can actually engage with the democratic process. You can write to the respective minister or whoever it may be, and make your voice heard. Because at the end of the day, it is so important that we speak up and speak out when we see these things happening. If we sit and say nothing, then we've only really ourselves to blame if we do find ourselves living in a world where our religious freedoms have been significantly impaired. And again, I mean, just to say that, yes, while we have rights, let's defend these rights so that the gospel can be freely preached and proclaimed. That's the essence of it. It doesn't really matter what other religion or ideology is able to also enjoy equal opportunity in the marketplace of ideas, as long as the gospel can be preached. That's really what 4SA believes. So we will defend all religions because our constitution gives equal protection to all religions, but motivation is so that the gospel can continue to be preached, proclaimed, and lived out in our lives, because that's what freedom of religion is. It's the ability that we have been given and the opportunity we've been given to actually live out our faith, to speak out our faith, to share our faith, and obviously pass our faith on to our children and our children's children as well.
So, Michael, if our listeners want to perhaps get a bit more involved than just getting your newsletter and being involved, is there a place where they can go support you guys financially? Can they volunteer? Are there any opportunities for them to get involved in that way?
Well, God bless you for giving that opportunity. Yes, there is front and center on on our webpage, there is a donate button, and on our Facebook page as well. And we are entirely dependent upon voluntary donations and contributions. And trust me, the other side are incredibly well financed. We find literally sometimes from month to month, we are battling to keep our heads above water. So every bit of support, no matter how big or small, is extremely welcome and needed, so that we have at least a war chest so that we can stay in this fight.
Wonderful. Well, there you have it to our listeners. If you please are able to give a few rand, go support Forsa for the wonderful work they're doing. And if you'd like to find out more, go visit their Facebook page and their website. And Michael, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for spending this last half an hour with us. We really appreciate your time, and we appreciate you coming to talk to our listeners to inform them a bit more about, like you said, the marketplace of ideas and the battle of ideas that's raging not only in South Africa but in the world at the moment.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity you've given.
Thank you so much. And then to you as listener, be sure to subscribe to the Death, Taxes and Change podcast, the podcast where the certain things in life are not as certain as you may think. Leave us a review on iTunes and on Castbox. It usually helps us to go up in the rankings for more people to get the podcast. The Death, Taxes and Change podcast is proudly brought to you by Podmedia.